Good evening and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society's fourth movie club. Since this is still a relatively new project, it's worth mentioning that the idea for the movie club is that it will be essentially like a book club. We pick a movie every month, people watch it on their own, and then we get together and have a discussion. Unlike your average book club, we'll supply experts to help understand and verify the stories told in the movie. This evening, we'll discuss the 1984 film, The Bostonians, and we are joined by two experts who help guide us through this discussion and answer questions. As I'm sure many of you know, the Massachusetts Historical Society hosts a variety of public programs, seminars, and teacher workshops throughout the course of the year. We offer many of these programs for free or for a very modest cost, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you enjoy being a part of our movie club, we hope you'll consider becoming a member of MHS to support our work. Now, to begin our conversation, we are joined by Jim Vrabel and Susan Wilson. Jim Vrabel is a former newspaper reporter, longtime community activist, local historian, and city official. He is the author of A People's History of the New Boston and When in Boston, A Timeline and Almanac, which is a fantastic resource if you need to find out facts about Boston. Susan Wilson is the house historian at the Omni Parker House. She is also a scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University and an honorary fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Jim and Susan.
Thanks, Gavin. Thanks to the Mass Historical Society for inviting us to take part in this program. I want to say that it is an honor to take part in a program with Susan Wilson, who opened the doors to Boston history for me and so many other people with her Boston History Notebook series in the Boston Globe years back. Boston history could be very dry and very daunting back then, and people like Susan and the late Tom O'Connor made it accessible and gave people permission and a reason to enter it. And I hope I am following in their lead.
I have to leave now.
With that, I'll try to get to the movie. The people making this movie had so much to work with.
Told me about you.
Merchant and Ivory, known for their lush settings and scenes, had Victorian Boston. Ruth Prower Jabala had a book by Henry James. Henry James is not for everyone. Mark Twain said of a book, presumably any book by Henry James, once you put it down, you simply can't pick it up. But if you can pick it up, and if you appreciate the language and the craftsmanship and the plot and the ability to increase the tension as you go along, you realize there is a reason he's called the master. And the movie makers did a good job in leaving as much of the book in as possible. I'd like to talk in my opening remarks about what they did and didn't take from the book and where they departed from it, and some of the departures and uses of history and geography. We start out with organ music, America, first sung by the children's choir of the Park Street Church, and a carriage ride that introduces us to the first two characters. We begin with Olive Chancellor, played remarkably well by Vanessa Redgrave. She's older than the character in the book, but which presents a different dynamic, but she is terrific.
What do you need?
Christopher Reeve is also terrific, playing the kind of shallow, skeptical, cynical, romantic who wants to change the world.
Also, Jim, very, very handsome.
Okay, in uniform or out?
Sorry.
They're on their way to the South End, and the carriage takes them down Mount Vernon Street, which is kind of an odd way to get from Charles Street to the South End. And the first scene we have is in the home of Mrs. Miss Birdseye. There's a departure both from the book and history here, because the South End's days were numbered at this time, and it was starting to recede as a neighborhood, as we're told in the late George Apley. And James describes the residence as a common residence shared by a few people, among whom there prevailed a vagueness of boundary. That's pure Jamesian logic. And we wonder what he is suggesting there. Miss Birdseye herself is clearly modeled after Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. James doesn't do her any favors. He calls her a confused, entangled, discursive old woman, which is not fair at all. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, Jessica Tandy does a great job in the role that she is handed. In real life, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody was one of the leaders of the Transcendental movement, a keen intellect, somewhat disheveled and disorganized, but called Boston's grandmother. James denied he was modeling the character after her, but he knew her. His father had carried on a correspondence with Peabody years before. James knew her. He hadn't seen her in 20 years when the book was written. She was still alive. She would live until 1894. And James took a lot of heat for how he portrayed the character.
Jim, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
My understanding, though, was that James, under the influence of his friends, also lightened up and on her and wasn't as heavy-handed, because she actually comes off as one of the more likable characters here, or that James isn't as hard on her as he is on many of the other women in the movie or the book.
Okay, but if you called me confused, entangled, inconsequent, discursive, and that was lightening up, I'd hate to see what coming down hard on somebody is. The next character we come to is Mr. Pardon. Terrific job by Wallace Shawn. Wallace Shawn always does a terrific job, but it is in the book and the movie, he's described as writing for the magazines and the transcript. I'm not sure the transcript would hire someone like Wallace Shawn. Transcript was a very proper Bostonian newspaper. That's best illustrated by the story of the butler who went into his boss's drawing room to say, sir, there are 3 reporters at the door and a gentleman from the transcript. So I don't think a hustler like Mr. Pardon would make it on the transcript staff. Next we come to Dr. Prance. Linda Hunt is terrific. Like Redgrave, she is older than the character portrayed in the book. As in the book and the movie, Ransom takes a shine to Dr. Prance. The only thing he doesn't like about Dr. Prance is that she gives the impression that she thought Verena rather slim. What a great line. She's rather slim. So now we get to Verena, Madeline Potter, who also does a very good job of illustrating a young woman who we suspect has little there. The movie gives her more credit for speaking ability than the book. In the book, Ransom said that she was full of schoolgirl phrases, childish lapses of logic, and flights of fancy. The movie makers, right from the start, give her an eloquence that James didn't intend her to have. And in some ways, they undercut what is supposed to be a satire and make her more believable and give both Ransom and Olive a little more reason for being smitten by her. And now I'd like to go into some of the locations. Olive's house. It's supposed to be on Charles Street and probably clearly modeled after the house and salon of James and Annie Fields, which was on Charles Street, on the water side of Charles Street, with a river view. That's what James says in the book. Here, somehow she's able to look out the window and see both the slope of Beacon Hill and Beacon Street at the same time. You know, we Bostonians look for these things, so it's a movie-making license, but it's just something to note. The interior is terrific. It's set in the Gibson House, Victorian museum, built in 1859. It was Charles Gibson turned into a museum in the 1930s. And it's spot on and a great choice for the movie makers.
In which, by the way, you can visit to this day. It's a wonderful walk into Victorian Boston. It really is.
The Athenaeum is the Athenaeum. And the next slide, there it is. Established in 1807. This building was built in 1849. Interestingly, women were not routinely allowed inside until 1856. Prior to that, they had to get special permission, and if they wanted to remain in there during the staff lunch hour, they had to be locked in to protect their modesty. There's a curious scene here in which Miss Birdseye seems to be offering a book to Ransom that she says is Woman of the 19th Century, and that Verena had written for the last convention, which I think would upset Margaret Fuller, a contemporary of Peabody's and Margaret Fuller's fans. But again, this is the movies.
But they got away with it because Margaret Fuller had already died in 1850.
Well, that was convenient, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The next scenes I talk about are at Harvard, and they are straight from the book. They're historically accurate. Interestingly, the scene at Memorial Hall, again, is straight from the book. And it's a case where both James in the book and the movie makers show us a kind of serious side to Ransom when they're looking at the plaques on the wall of the Harvard men killed in the recent war. Verena chirps, "These were brave men. It says so in Latin." To which Ransom replies, "Yes, they were. I should know. I had to fight them." And he kind of chokes up with emotion. It's interesting that James, who wasn't taking anything seriously in the novel, includes this serious scene, and the movie makers do too. It's as if they couldn't not include something about the Civil War, and they couldn't be ironic about it either.
Jim, can I add something on that?
Sure.
What some people may not know is that Memorial Hall, which also many people have gone to Sanders Theater within Memorial Hall for concerts, that both men who went to Harvard were Union soldiers as well as Confederate soldiers, but at Memorial Hall only the Union soldiers are commemorated. So a whole different level of this is that Basil Ransom supposedly fought for the Confederacy, and so he's standing there looking at names of Union soldiers, but many Confederates who went to Harvard did die but were not commemorated here, and that was a huge controversy for many years.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
We should also note that Soldiers Field Road is named after the soldiers who died in the Civil War, and all the land along it where the Harvard Business School is was purchased by Thomas Handseed Perkins and given to Harvard in memory of those soldiers who died. I'll move along. The next one is the next setting is Acorn Street, and I chose this because they show women pouring out of one of the houses after a meeting. I'm not sure that's accurate because the houses on Acorn Street were built for the craftspeople and the help who worked in the houses on Chestnut and Mount Vernon. I don't know when it is that people who might host these meetings, who were more intellectual and better off, moved in. I do know that they seem to be coming out of the door, one door up from the house of the late John Winthrop Sears, a great friend of Mass Historical Society and of mine. The women would have been very welcome there, as he was a very liberal Republican, but they would not have been able to fit because every spare surface and piece of floor was filled with books on Boston history. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to mention another scene, and that's the tea that Mrs. Burrage has with Olive Chancellor in New York. And it is vintage Henry James. They're circling around like two spiders, where Mrs. Burrage is basically trying to buy Verena from Olive, saying that whatever means we have are at the disposal of your movement. And in the book, Olive thinks that people like Mrs. Burrage lived and fattened on abuses, prejudices, and privileges. Ouch. She also says that, I dare say, I don't think you want her to marry anyone, given that your friendship with her is of so much interest. But the biggest departure is at the end, and that's where the Basil sweeps Verena off her feet and takes her on the night train to New York. And in the morning, they'll be married. In the book, it's not such a happy ending. James writes that in this union, at the final scene, Verena is in tears, and James writes, in this union so far from brilliant, in which she was about to enter, these were not the last she was destined to shed. That's the last line of the book. The movie, on the other hand, is much more upbeat at the scene in the music hall when Olive rises to the stage. And Ruth Prowler Jadvala hijacks the words of William Lloyd Garrison from 40 years before, in which he talks about his personal commitment to abolition. She changes the I to we and substitutes the women's movement and has Olive say, we will not excuse, we will not equivocate, and we will be heard. A much more upbeat, romantic, dramatic ending that leaves us much more satisfied than Henry James ever did.
Jim, can I add something about the music hall?
Sure.
The music hall is what, on the site of what today is the Orpheum Theater at the end of Hamilton Street. There is great discussion about whether any of the old foundation of the music hall is part of the Orpheum today, and I've never seen a convincing argument one way or the other. But I know that most of the Orpheum is newer. But curiously, even though the Orpheum's there, they didn't decide to film it there. That this particular, in the upper left, the music hall where Olive is speaking, is in Troy, New York. But they wanted to have this organ because, you know, there's an organ at the end, but also the entire beginning, the whole opening scene are these amazing images of an organist playing and all the stops coming out. That was actually recorded in Worcester at Mechanics Hall because the organ in Troy, New York wasn't working very well at the time. So they were, you know, they're talking about Boston, filming in Troy, New York, and recording in Worcester. So just an interesting side.
Well, that's what I have for my opening remarks. I think it's a great adaptation of a book by Henry James, a great movie about Boston. There's so much going on there. It does bounce back and forth between the satire and the send-up of the women's movement and of romance in general. You don't know whether to take it seriously or not. In the book, you do know whether to take it seriously, but you don't. The movie, I think Vincent Canby has some kind of a line about a comedy with tragic undertones. but it's very, very satisfying, and it's food for thought and food for the eyes and ears of any fan of Boston and Boston history. And speaking of fans of Boston and Boston history, take it away, Susan.
So I get these wonderful subjects: women, marriage, medicine, and misogyny. All right, then, let's tackle.
I just want to point out that you chose them.
I know, and I like the alliteration as well. Okay, thanks. All right, first of all, we have the big three, okay? That the basic premise of this entire book is that there's this triangle, this competition going on for the life and affections of the woman in the middle, our friend Verena. Interestingly enough, regarding the characters, Olive, played by Vanessa Redgrave. By the way, she got the most accolades for this of anyone in the movie. The only two things that they were nominated for Academy Awards for were her playing Olive Chancellor, and also for the costumes. So other people didn't get credit. So Olive did. She didn't win, by the way, but Vanessa did a great job. Curiously, it was supposed to be played by Glenn Close. Originally, they chose Vanessa Redgrave, and then there were some problems with her, and she dropped out. And Glenn Close was ready to play it, and in fact, the clothes were all adapted to Glenn Close, who apparently is shorter than Vanessa Redgrave. And then at the last minute,
excuse me, Susan, was it going to be called, instead of the Bostonians, Fatal Attraction? Go ahead.
Anyway, apparently Glenn Close had a last minute opportunity to work with Robert Redford, which he said was every female actor's, or they probably said actress back then, dream. And so I think it was The Natural or something she went and played. And so she dropped out and they pulled Vanessa back in. And then of course, Vanessa shone. So that's number one. Number two is I just found out that Madeline Potter, who I think we've all lost track of, that we probably remember the person on the left and the person on the right, but not the one in the middle. That one of the people being considered for this role was a 21-year-old Yale student named Jodie Foster. So I think that might have been interesting. So anyway, we've got this thing happening here, and from some reviews. Oh, if we can go back just for a second, some reviews at the time about this. The Bostonians is so good looking and well acted a movie that it's quite unreasonable story premise based on the Henry James novel nearly gets overlooked. The idea that this triangle existed is kind of unnerving, but also Louise Hall Tharp in the Peabody Sisters of Salem said, Henry James' book, The Bostonians, was read and taken much more seriously than now. It seems possible considering the incredible dialogue, incredible being unbelievable, like I can't believe that's the dialogue, the unconvincing characters created so obviously for the sole purpose of proving the case against equal suffrage. And the final comment being, and this has to do with Henry James' misogyny, which I will say is apparent even if this is a comedy. The story premise, as the movie tells it, is that there was nothing wrong with the suffragette movement that a good old-fashioned male chauvinist couldn't fix. So I just love that a lot. Okay, if we could go ahead. All right, so we have these two embracing girls. Okay, Vanessa Redgrave as Olive Chancellor, Madeline Potter as Verena Tarrant. They are very close. They are very, very close. They are in what we call, next slide, or they are, yes, among the words that they are continually saying, Olive to Verena, I want to know you. Will you be my friend of friends, forever and ever? Verena, perhaps you like me too much. There's no question throughout that in this close affection and this mentorship and something closer than mentorship, that it matters a whole lot more to Olive than it does to Verena. And I think both these actors do a quite credible job of doing that, of showing that this is an unusually close relationship. Okay. This brings up something that this movie is known for, which is something called the Boston marriage. Boston marriages it was a term used, as far as we can tell, and if someone in the audience knows otherwise, it would be great to hear, that this term, the phenomena existed prior to this book, but that the term Boston marriage came into use after the Bostonians because of Henry James the Bostonians, and because these two characters had a very loving relationship that was extremely close for two women and seemed more like a male-female relationship at the time. Boston marriages didn't, so if anyone knows if there's any other origin, I can't find anything else. Now, the fact is, Henry James never says Boston marriage, but because people saw this phenomena and read about it, which to some people seemed a little scandalous, they began calling it that. A Boston marriage, these existed in Boston. They also existed in other places, but Boston was kind of like the hotbed, especially after the Civil War. It involved two women, generally of means, because they had to be able to support themselves. So they either had wealth from their family, like Olive, or they were working women, and who professionals who could make their own living, because generally women couldn't afford to live on their own or live together. They needed a man's income in order to do that. So these women would live together. Here's by Helen Howe in The Gentle Americans, her description. There were in my parents' circle of friends in Boston several households consisting of two ladies living sweetly and devotedly together. Such an alliance I was brought up to hear called a Boston marriage. Such a marriage existed between Mrs. Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett. Father wrote of it as a union. There is no truer word of it. Now, Helen Howe was, in fact, if we can stay on the slide, she was the daughter. If we can go back to the previous slide. Whoop, there. No, go ahead. Yes, right here. She was the daughter of Mark Anthony DeWolf Howe, who wrote extensively about Boston history and actually knew many of the people. There are many controversies about what this meant. People have said, okay, are Boston marriages 19th century lesbian relationships, or are they romantic friendships? Are they just two people that are working women and don't have time to get married, etc.? And the fact is, they were probably all of those. There were some that were probably clearly lesbian relationships, some that were simply two women who, if they were professionals, simply didn't have time to have children, to take care of husbands, and certainly didn't want to stay at home in what is often called the domestic sphere. And every ramification, everything in between certainly existed. Where any given relationship lay within that spectrum, we know very little about, because unless people wrote about it, I'm thinking, if any of you are watching on HBO Gentleman Jack about Ann Lister, there was a clear case of a woman who was an out lesbian at a time when things like that weren't out. However, things were much subtler in Boston in the Victorian era. And so we don't really know unless things are written. Now, what's interesting is, a mention here is between Mrs. Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett. Mrs. Fields was the widow of Jamie Fields, who was part of Ticknor and Fields of the Old Corner Bookstore, who were the publishers of literary Boston in the mid-19th century. When her husband died in 1881, Sarah Orne Jewett, another author from Maine, South Berwick, Maine, moved in with her, and they basically lived together, were treated as a couple, traveled together, stayed in each other's homes alternately between Maine and Boston, ran writing and literary salons together. And if anyone invited one, they would invite the other. They were treated like a married couple. And they were actually together longer than Annie Fields was with her husband. When the letters of Sarah Orne Jewett were published, Mark Anthony DeWolf Howe, our friend mentioned at the bottom, specifically said, there's a bunch of stuff you cannot print because it's going to be too scandalous. And there was letters between these two women that included, I can't wait to see you, I want to kiss you all over your body, things that their nicknames, Fluffy, whatever, that they called each other. And everyone thought, this is sounding a little too scandalous. Okay, next slide. However, for the most part, in Victorian Boston, sexuality was not being considered, okay? And in Henry James' time, these are people that he may well have been aware of, women who were in what were considered Boston marriages. We already mentioned Annie Adams Field and Sarah Orne Jewett. Henry's sister, Alice James, with Catherine Peabody Loring. Catherine Lee Bates, you may remember her from America the Beautiful, not to be confused with the actor, Kathy Bates, and Catherine Ellis Coleman, Anne Whitney, the sculptor, and Abby Adeline Manning, Marie Zakshevska and Julia Sprague. Marie founded the New England Hospital for Women and Children. Lucy Sewell and Sophia Jex Blake, at least for a short period, lived together in a Boston marriage. And Susan Dimick and Elizabeth Willard Green. Susan Dimick, I know a great deal about because I just finished writing a book about her. So Henry saw all of this. It would appear that he was very curious. It would appear that he had a combination of curiosity and animosity for these things, but was trying to figure them out. Okay, go ahead. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing that Henry James didn't seem too wild about, and it was clear in the book as well as clear in the film, was he was clearly trying to mock the suffrage movement. At the time when this takes place, and we see flash right in the beginning of the movie, it says 1875, the women's movement was huge in Boston. Part of this was because the war was over, and many of the people in Boston who were in progressive politics and trying to make change prior to the Civil War, there were many, many movements, but two of the biggest ones were abolitionism and transcendentalism. And both of those made great efforts to change the world, and in many ways did. Once the war was over, there were no more abolitionists. A lot of the original transcendentalists, including Miss Birdseye, Elizabeth Peabody, many of those people were dying out. And it was huge. Suffrage was gigantic, and many, many women of all classes, particularly upper classes, but of all classes, were involved. If you show the next slide, leading up to this period, these were some of the things that were happening in Boston in the years leading up to when Henry James' novel and the movie took place. The creation of the New England Women's Club. Women's clubs were huge associations for progressive women working outside the home, doing things that women traditionally weren't supposed to do. The New England Women's Suffrage Association, and then the American Women's Suffrage Association. Mary Livermore, who was one of the major, most important, eloquent speakers, probably not Verena, but of the level you're talking about. Verena supposedly could just enchant anyone, and Mary Livermore was like that. The Woman's Journal was created by Lucy Stone. In 1870, the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, a huge suffrage fair at Boston's Music Hall, which we've already talked about in 1871, and then at Faneuil Hall, the centennial celebration of the Tea Party, which of course included the call of no taxation without representation, women saying the same thing. How can you tax us if we're not represented? So all of these things, it's huge. And Henry James didn't seem particularly wild about that, and certainly mocked it in the movie and the book. Okay. Among the big shots of the era, this is just tip of the iceberg, in suffrage at the time, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, she of multiple fames, Mary Livermore, and even our friend Louisa May Alcott, who I think was featured in our last film club. So all of these were big shots in the suffrage movement, who obviously did many other things at the same time. Okay. And so here we have Basil Ransom just ranting against it. It's a feminine, a nervous, hysterical, chattering, canting age, and age of hollow phrases and false delicacy and exaggerated solicitudes and coddled sensibilities. Many people think that Henry James was using Basil Ransom to voice his own feelings. But since he was living amidst all these progressives in the Boston area, or at least visiting them, he was in England more often than he was here, he had to put it in the knee-jerk verbiage of this Southerner who was kind of Neanderthal in his views. And then, of course, we have the very sincere and always crumbling Olive because she's always distressed. He's our enemy, the enemy of our sex and our cause. Okay.
Susan, can I, I
Yeah.
just wanted to add, there's a great scene in the book that where James actually does right by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody that isn't in the movie. And I just want to read the last couple of words. It's when Miss Birdseye asked them to have Ransom come to the porch just before she dies. And she tells him, you mustn't think there's no progress because you don't see it all right off. That's what I wanted to say. It isn't until you have gone a long way that you can feel what's been done. That's what I see when I look back from here. I see that the community wasn't half waked up when I was young. The word wake, which we're still using or using.
Yeah, we use woke today. Now. Woke.
That's right. That's right.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. Okay. Next slide, please. And then, of course, Ransom, realizing that Verena is at least a good, it's not clear that she's really a feminist or a suffragist, but she is a wonderful puppet or mouthpiece of the movement and very useful in that way. But of course, Basil wants her to come back into his Neanderthal world. Your gift is indestructible. Think how delightful it will be when your influence becomes really social. Your facility, as you call it, will simply make you in conversation the most charming woman in America. It's like, okay, fine. That's the end. Okay, so a couple more items. Next slide, please. Okay, we have in the opening scene that Jim already discussed, Verena is getting ready to give her talk, but her father, Dr., and I put that in quotes, Sela Tarrant, okay, if we go to the next slide, has to conjure this. And so he has to stand behind her and bring this out because he is in fact a mesmerist. And this is mesmerism and spiritualism were very, very big in Boston at the time. And this is clearly being mocked by Henry James. And again, I would argue that like the suffrage movement and feminism, I think he's fascinated by it at the same time that he's kind of making fun of it. So I think he's both investigating and, or my feeling is he's investigating while mocking it. And so of course, because he's doing this with his daughter and prepping her to be able to give her talk, mesmerism is made to look like a joke, and also feminism and suffrage by default. But just an example, I don't know, when I was in college, I remember going to the Exeter Street Theater to see movies. And the Exeter Street Theater was, in fact, on Exeter Street, the first spiritual temple of the Working Union of Progressive Spiritualists. It was Richardsonian Romanesque, and the building, I guess, is it a restaurant now or a bookstore? I've lost track. Jim, do you know?
No, I don't.
Okay, but anyway, this was a major chapel. And there were enough spiritualists and people who cared about communing with the dead and rapping on tables and talking to the dead. Next slide. Among those was Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. And she came to Boston often for a variety of reasons, but appearing on this by a photographer named Mumler. Mumler specialized in taking spirit photos in which he would have the person there and then conjure up the dead person behind them. And so this was an example, and he made quite a good living. He was actually taken to court later on for forgery, but nobody could ever quite figure out how he did it, including several local legitimate Boston photographers. So, but this was a big deal at the time. Also, in the next slide, the largest, probably most important spiritualist newspaper, the Banner of Light, was also published in Boston. And what's interesting, because Henry James is encountering all of this, is that both the Spiritualist Banner of Light and Lucy Stone's Women's Journal were based in Boston, but had a national audience and were probably in their respective fields the most important publications nationwide for those two things. So Henry had a lot he was batting against. Okay. And then the last section, One of Henry's favorite characters, and I think, Jim, you're in my favorite characters,
Uh-huh.
is Dr. Prance. And Linda Hunt plays this. Among the ways that Henry describes her in the book, a sturdy little doctress. Well, if you're going to do little, Linda Hunt does it. A plain, spare young woman with short hair and an eyeglass, okay, and she looked like a boy. And you may remember that she has played males in movies, so she's able to do that all. What's interesting is that at this time, in 1875, there were a number of woman doctors in Boston, and who had managed to get education despite the fact that the finest medical schools were not allowing women in, including Harvard, who let the first women into their medical college in 1945. And this is 1875. Love that. Anyway, that women who went into professions, and especially into medicine, were often called in the press manly, unsexed. They thought Elizabeth Blackwell, who was a pioneering doctor in New York, was when somebody met her, he said he thought that she might be growing a beard, because how could a woman do this? Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. However, Dr. Prance is apolitical, and one gets the impression she's more concerned with medicine. And so that's one of the reasons Basil likes her. Well, I've got some work. I don't want anyone to teach me what a woman can do. And then when asked by Basil, she says, men and women are all the same to me. I don't see any difference. There's room for improvement in both sexes. Neither of them is up to the standard. So interestingly enough, the next slide. One of the reasons there were so many women doctors in Boston was because Dr. Marie Zakshevska had in fact founded the New England Hospital for Women and Children, which today is the same campus, the same buildings, is the Dimmock Center in Roxbury. They did originally start in downtown Boston, but by the time Henry James is writing about this, Dr. Zakshevska and many of the people working under her, many of the women, were very important in town. What's interesting is some of them, like my biography subject, Susan Dimmock, really didn't get involved in politics because they were doing medicine 24/7. So to that extent, that kind of reflects Dr. Prance. On the other hand, many of them were adamant suffragists, and Dr. Zakshevska was in fact a very, very strong suffragist. So, okay. And I think, that's it. That's it for my segment. So we can't wait to hear what you all have to say or ask or anything, because that's what this is about, is a conversation with you all.
Bring it on.
Great. So people are encouraged to raise their hand if they have a question or a comment. There's a number of comments in the chat. A couple of them are about what the Exeter Street Theater is today. It apparently is a Montessori school.
Okay.
But if people would like to make a comment, please raise your hand and ask a question.
Well, let's think of one. What would we like to ask?
Is that you, Mary?
So it looks like Arlene Isaacson has a question. We can, there we go. She's unmuted.
Susan, I'd be interested in knowing if you know anything about the relationship between Henry and his sister.
Unfortunately, very little. She, as you may know, was very troubled, and she had a lot of problems. But I wish. Does anyone else know? Because I don't know that the answer to that. Jim, do you know perchance?
No, I do know that she and he both lived just around the corner on Mount Vernon Street off Charles Street at different times. And she also lived with their father for a time until he died. But I don't know the relationship. Henry was mostly in Europe during these times.
Exactly.
The family lived on Ashburton Place, where Elizabeth Peabody lived in a boarding house, actually. And then 20 years later, they lived down on Mount Vernon Street and Charles Street. but
This is
um,
Megan Marshall just saying that Jean
Oh.
Strauss's, Jean Strauss's biography of Alice James is wonderful. And I think you get a sense that Henry and Alice were very close. And I don't know if he was necessarily put off by her friendships with women. I wouldn't say that. I guess I just want to say a couple of things. One is on Elizabeth Peabody as Miss Birdseye. I read in a few places that a pea body is a bird's eye. So that's one way you can think about it. And there's also something to me that really is very deep misogyny, I guess you would say, which is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a fabric called bird's eye. Do you know about this? It's a fabric that is still today used for diapers, cloth diapers, but was also used by women for their menstrual blood. So, and it was very well known that this fabric, bird's eye. So I've always meant to write something about further about that, his use of that word bird's eye for you know, he always denied that was Elizabeth Peabody. But another point I wanted to make, just back on the scenes in the wonderful movie, Jim showed us the Athenaeum, but I always love the you actually enter the Athenaeum and you see the exterior, where there's this amazing tree that's growing in that now absolutely barren little courtyard that you cross. And I haven't lived in Boston long enough ever to have seen that tree when it was still living, but that's one of, for me, the most precious moments in the film, to see that.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Megan. I appreciate it.
and we should point out that Megan Marshall is the author of the Peabody Sisters, so she knows from whereof she speaks.
But I didn't take their lives as far as Louise Hall Tharp did, so I didn't really comment on Miss Birdseye in that.
Susan, is there an assumption that in fact that his sister was in a Boston marriage and that his sister that James knew that?
Oh, yes. And but things that I've read, some say that one of the reasons that he had a complete fascination with that and perhaps mixed with antipathy, but other sources say that he was more fascinated by Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, that those were his inspirations. So I've seen both argued. Megan, do you know? You know,
I think the fact that Alice was an invalid kind of invalidated the Boston marriage aspect of that friendship. I mean, maybe Catherine Peabody was sort of taking care of her as well, but I think he really enjoyed being in the orbit of Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, and I think that's why, people were sort of surprised that he took this view. But just one last thing though on that is, I don't know a lot about Merchant and Ivory, but I think they were partners. And I wonder, and I don't know how out they were at the time they were making this film. And to me, it seems like the film itself is a kind of, bittersweet love song to same-sex love that can't really be fulfilled or made public. And I think it may have some kind of autobiographical sense to it for them. I met Ruth Jabvala actually while I was researching the Peabody sisters in England, just shortly after the film came out. And I know one of the other things in the script was she really was, aside from referring to the book Women in the 19th Century, she does take a lot of language from women in the 19th century to put into Verena Tarrant's mouth. And I just admire the script a great deal.
Well, and at the end of the movie, there's a little homage to Miss Peabody, because Olive allows Verena to have one last liaison with Basil, and she said, "I'm going to write a letter to Miss Peabody."
Mm-hmm. Well, I also happen to be friends with a designing team, Philidor Press, that made some of the props for the film, including, if you notice, there's a scene where you see a poster that they put up advertising Verena's last last talk, the one that she doesn't give. And I happen to, they made it in 2 sizes, the small one that ended up in the film and a large one. And I happen to have one of those posters, and it mentions Elizabeth Peabody, all these, you know, Elizabeth Peabody, Margaret Fuller, all these women. It's a kind of beautiful thing that I think now I should give to the Mass Historical Society if they would.
Megan,
have it.
are those the ones that that Basil was ripping off?
Yes, exactly. So my friends made that, and they made a bunch of them and had extra ones. And
I love that.
Yeah.
I wanted to add something else about Boston Marriage. And Jim alluded to this in the beginning. I found that I personally found that the connection between Olive and Verena was a little off-putting because Verena seemed old enough to be her mother. And so if it was a guy, we would have said dirty old man, I think. And so I found that a little off-putting. But the fact is that, and Jim mentioned this, in the book, they never tell us anyone's age in the book. But they do tell us that Basil was older than Olive. So Christopher Reeve was supposed to be older than Vanessa Redgrave. But in real life, Vanessa Redgrave is 15 years older than Christopher Reeve. So I think that, I don't know.
And in the book, she's described as a young woman, as
Right.
is Dr. Prance, as is Wallace Shawn. They're all very
No, he's not a young woman, he's a young man.
Yeah, but they're all very young. And that, it throws it off. That's why I said there was a different dynamic with Redgrave in the
Right.
role than in the book.
Right, but when you see Basil and Verena, yeah, you think he's older, but it's okay. Like she's 19 and he's 30 or something.
Yeah.
But I, you know, you really feel like Olive could be her mom. And so despite the fact that I thought Redgrave did an amazing job, I thought that was a little odd and mildly off-putting. I don't know if anyone else reacted that way. The other thing I wanted to mention about Boston Marriages is there's some discussion of this, to my knowledge, and but that in the 19th century or in the Victorian era, people didn't think of those in terms of sex, or most people didn't think of them in terms of sex. And we don't really get people getting upset about that idea until the 20th century and Freud. And then suddenly it's like, oh, what's going on there? And then we see the concept of Boston Marriage petering out.
So I'd like to just point out that Meredith Bergman has raised her hand. So perhaps she'd like to unmute herself and ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that the movie was absolutely wonderful and I'm enjoying this discussion tremendously. I wondered what had become of the element of satire. And I think Megan Marshall answered that the movie really has another focus, which is on a love story that does not work out, that is interrupted by a predatory male. However, if Ruth Jabala did tack on that final scene where Olive finally finds her voice, that seemed to me to turn the ship in the middle of the ocean towards an affirmation of women's power, and no more satire, not a trace of it. So
Right.
I'm now eager to read the novel, which to my shame I have not done. Thank you.
And James would have hated that
Oh yes,
tacked
yes,
on ending.
totally. By the way, I've a friend of mine mentioned, I don't know if Susan Porter is here, but I was talking to her the other day and she said, you know, I have to say this is one case where I really thought the movie was better than the book.
So Mark Gallagher has his hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Mark, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks for the great discussion so far, Jim and Susan. You know, I love this movie, and the only thing I don't like about the movie is the casting of Verena, but I won't get into that. Wow, if it was Jodie Foster, this would have been amazing. But it's still such a great movie. I've always read the Bostonians as not like I never at any time feel like Henry James is voicing some misogyny, but I feel like as a novel, the Bostonians is showing how the form that it's taking, the novel as a form, is somewhat misogynistic, because okay, as a novel, it's kind of doing a few things. It's combining the North-South Civil War romance genre, right, with this sort of the domestic novel that we get from earlier in the century, and it's recombining these forms. And I feel like when it does that, it's trying to. I feel like James is like the male who's trying to or trying to invent a new kind of voice for women, but he feels constrained by the conventions of the romance, which is embodied by Basil and his sort of chivalric pursuit of Verena, right? And then that's why I think that's why so many people didn't like the novel when it came out, because it has such an odd ending, right? Like there's the love plot. They get together at the end, but it's tragic. And then you have Olive, but we don't hear her voice. We just hear the reaction of people to her. So it gives a woman that agency and says, here she is, she's now achieving that, but the novel can't have anything to do with that. The novel can't presume to speak for that woman, but it can speak for this problematic misogynistic idea that's so popularized in the novel as a form, which is the romance of chivalry. So I don't know. Do you think Henry James was misogynistic, or do you think this movie might have made the Bostonians seem misogynistic?
Jim,
I'll start
I've
because
already said what. Jim, you go for it.
yes, I think he was misogynistic, but it wasn't that his dislike of women. It was more his dislike of the women's movement. And I think it was a choice on his part to bring somebody up from the South. This is more like red states and blue states. He brings a real man up from the red states to try and talk some sense into these woke Bostonians. And that's what we have here.
And that's just the opposite of the Civil War romance, where you have a Union soldier falling in love with a Southern belle. So it's like, well, why not reverse that and see what possibilities there are for reforming male chauvinism?
Well, and James was all about culture wars. And mostly it was Americans and Europeans, but here he has a chance to do the South and the North and have this these scatterbrained woke Northerners have a Southerner come in amidst them and try to restore a little bit of order, natural order to things.
And I'm not sure that we've alluded to this or not, but one of the things that comes up in his manifest in Miss Birdseye is that she represents the heroic age of progressive Boston, and that the real serious things like transcendentalism and abolitionism, for example, and that this newfangled stuff that's come up since the Civil War is kind of lightweight compared to those kind of reforms.
Yeah,
well, and James says that right out. He said, he felt that Verena knew she missed the heroic age, and they're all looking at Miss Birdseye as someone who participated in it.
Right.
Interestingly enough, Miss Birdseye didn't come to abolition till late in the game, and she was in Europe during the Civil War.
Thank you.
Oh, interestingly, also Henry James was of age and could have fought in the Civil War, but he came up with unexpected back pain.
But his brothers were officers in the 54th Regiment.
In the 54th Regiment, yep.
Mm.
So I want to just acknowledge that it's now a little bit past 7 o'clock, and we usually try to wrap things up after about an hour. So I think this has been a fabulous conversation, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So I don't know if Jim and Susan, if you have any parting words you'd like to share. And I see Megan has also raised her hand, and so maybe she also has a parting comment.
Megan, you're on.
I'll just say briefly, Mark's comment was really very interesting, and it reminded me how James was influenced by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and the Blithedale Romance is a sort of pre-Civil War version of the same thing, with a feminist woman who's the brilliant speaker and inspired, and there's mesmerism, and it all ends badly. So that's another aspect of, what can you do with the novel as far as addressing these reform issues. But I think both Hawthorne and James were really brilliant at giving very complex female figures, and that there's a, the women are always the protagonists of their books. So you can't really say they're misogynist. I agree with you on that. And also Susan Porter said that in the novel, James does have Olive Chancellor stand up to speak in Verena's place. So just want to add that correction.
She does, but she doesn't. I think
she does. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what she does, and I mean the fact that she quotes Garrison, and you get a real strong feeling that people are starting, that this is the beginning of her new career.
Yeah, I see.
Whereas it's kind of just mentioned in the book. That's what I would say.
Anyway, thanks for a great program, Susan and Jim.
Thank you, Megan.
Okay, I have a final word, and I have to preface it by saying Susan suggested that I say this, and it's thanks to the Mass Historical Society for having us on, and say good night, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
All right, thank you all for coming, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I'm sure Jim and Susan would be happy to answer further questions. If you have them, you can direct them to programs@masshist.org, and we'll pass them on. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.